When I was flying home from Israel a few weeks ago, we were in line for an on-time departure. Don't you love that? On-time departure. And we were in queue. Don't you love that word, queue? Ready to go. And then I started hearing shouting and screaming and fighting. I could hear the sound of belligerence. And then I heard a flight attendant say, "Please do not engage in fisticuffs." I happily complied with that one. I love not engaging in fisticuffs. Fisticuffs is just not me. But do not engage in fisticuffs, and please do not shout at each other. And then the next thing I heard, the pilot said, "Ladies and gentlemen," you always dread that tone, right? "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to leave the queue." You don't ever want to hear "leave the queue." And then those dreaded words, "We have to go back to the gate." Yes. Yes, we have to go back to the gate because there were two passengers on a crowded United jet who absolutely refused to wear masks. And their refusal to wear masks was causing a whole brouhaha. And so we had to go back to the gate. Police came on board and arrested them. And then the coda to this delightful moment was we were 2 hours delayed because they had to get their luggage. Yes, more, please, I could use more sympathy. I'm in the market for sympathy. Thank you. We had to wait 2 hours until all of that luggage, sort through all this luggage, 300 people's luggage, to get 2 people's luggage who wouldn't wear masks. So, we have all heard and read stories of anger in the public square, on airplanes, at restaurants, or let's say you wanted to drive from Ottawa to the United States, on bridges. And as you know, all of this anger, all it does is victimize innocent people. It victimizes fellow travelers and flight attendants who are just trying to do a day's work and earn their day's pay. It victimizes fellow diners and waiters and waitresses at restaurants. It victimizes poor drivers who just want to get from point A to point B and are now stuck in traffic forever. What is that? Well, I want to give you a category for how to think about that kind of anger in the public square. It was something that I learned when I was in rabbinical school. And it's something I learned 30 years ago, but I've just been thinking a lot about it given the reality of our time. It's called the lightning rod phenomenon. Now, a lightning rod is actually a metal rod that is attached to a structure, to a building, and its function is literally to attract lightning to the lightning rod, and then the lightning rod disperses that lightning onto the ground so that the building itself is spared. It's a thing that exists in the physical world, but it is also a truth in the world of relationships. Now, this is something that happens to all clergy, 100% of clergy, no exceptions. This happens to over the course of a career in whatever clergy faith you are in. And that's why I learned about it in rabbinical school. But it doesn't only happen to clergy, it actually happens to all of us, and increasingly so nowadays. This is the classic lightning rod syndrome that you learn about and that we all see in who are in pastoral fields. Mrs. Cohn has just lost her husband of 60 years. And after the Shiva is over and the dust settles, Mrs. Cohn is really angry. She's angry that her husband has died. She is angry that her life has changed. She is angry that she is all alone. But what does she do with this anger? Where does she place this anger? She could be angry at her husband for dying, but he didn't want to die. He was a good husband. It's not his fault that he died. She could be angry at her adult kids who live far away. You know, it's hug, hug, kiss, kiss, and an Uber to the airport, and then I won't see them again for another X months. But they're not doing anything wrong. They're just living their own lives, like my husband and I lived our own life. She could be angry at God. Why did God let my husband die? But the truth is, that's just not so satisfying because she doesn't have that much of a relationship with God anyway. So she's got all this anger and nowhere to put it, and that's where the rabbi comes in handy. The rabbi is the lightning rod, and she expresses anger to the rabbi and at the rabbi and about the rabbi, and that actually allows the rest of the building, her husband, her children, her relationship with God, to be undisturbed. So, anger that is deeply felt, and it has nowhere to go, builds up, and it's got to spill out. And the lightning rod syndrome is about it spills out on whoever happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. People who don't deserve it, like passengers and diners and drivers. Now, it is obviously very unpleasant to receive anger that you didn't earn. But it's also very unpleasant to feel anger that's just so brewing inside you that you just have to spill it out on whoever. So here's my question. How do we not do that? How do we not lightning rod somebody else? And what's a useful way to think about the anger that we feel? What's a better way? What's a healthier way? What's a more sane way? What's a more grounded way? What's a better way to deal with the anger that we feel? So I want to tell you a story. When I was in Israel, my father-in-law and I spent many hours a day listening to podcasts of different Torah. And our favorite Torah podcast, and we spent hours on this, was a great podcast from Jewish Theological Seminary. He's an alum, I'm an alum. We love the seminary. And it's called What Now? And this is the arresting premise of the What Now. It's an amazing, sad, true premise. The woman who hosts this podcast is named Sarah Beth. And she tells her story on every one of the podcasts in brief. And it is this. 10 years ago, she was engaged. And her fiance was a fifth-year rabbinical student. Her fiance was actually a son of members of our congregation. His funeral would take place from right here. And they were happily engaged. She was at the seminary. He's a fifth-year rabbinical student. They're about to get married. And then he got very sick and he died suddenly and tragically. And now she finds herself, in her words, a 20-something-year-old widow. And now she finds herself a widow before she ever got married. And she's a student at the seminary, which is all about all these sacred texts. Bible, Talmud, Midrash, codes, philosophy, Ramban, all these smart Jews who have all these smart words. And she wonders, what do they say to me about how to figure out life that I'm a 20-something-year-old widow? I'm a widow before my marriage. What do those sources say to me? So she interviews different professors and asks them, what does your source say to people whose life is upside down, what now? They're all great podcasts. I highly recommend it. But here's my favorite one. She interviews a rabbi named Michal Springer, who's the head of pastoral psychology at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And Sarah Beth, the host, asks Rabbi Springer the question that she asks every guest on this podcast, which is, what's the worst thing, the most painful thing that ever happened to you? Or another way she phrases it is, if there's pain on a 1 to 10 scale, what's your 10? Or another way she phrases it is, what's your book of Job moment? So Rabbi Springer tells her as follows. She says that she grew up in the Boston area. She attended the Solomon Schechter Day School of Greater Boston. And her classmate was Aaron Kushner, who, as you all know, the son of Rabbi Harold and Suzette Kushner, who, as you all know, died young as a teenager from progeria, this terrible congenital disease. And she says she was at Schechter when he lived, and she was at Schechter when he died, and he saw how wrenching it was. But she saw how there's this thing called a community that holds people in their hardest hours and that heals people in their hardest hours. And while she was still in grade school, while she was still at Schechter, she said, that's what I want to do. I want to become a rabbi so that I can create this holding space, this healing space that can give people strength in their hardest moment. So she knows in grade school, I want to become a rabbi to create that space. She knows in high school, I want to go to rabbinical school and become a rabbi to create that space. She knows in college, I'm going to rabbinical school to become a rabbi to create that space. And she finds herself at the seminary. I'm going to learn how to create that space. And then when she is at the seminary, a very good friend of hers, who is 30 years old, dies suddenly, leaving a husband and an 18-month-old daughter. And Rabbi Springer says she was trained for this moment. This is why she was on planet Earth, to create this holding space that's going to give people strength and hope. And her Book of Job moment was, I don't have an earthly idea what to do now. I have no idea. I'm lost. I'm confused. I'm bereft. I was supposed to be here for just this moment, and I've got nothing. So Michal Springer is asked by Sarah Beth, what did you do? And what do the sources that you study and teach at the seminary tell you about how to think about what to do? So Michal Springer says she gets a lot of energy and strength from her favorite text, which she teaches to her pastoral psychology students. And it's a poem by Yehuda Amichai, an Israeli poet. And it's called El Mole Rachamim, which is a prayer which means El Mole Rachamim, God, full of compassion. And it's a prayer that we offer at Jewish funerals. And this is part of the poem translated. God, full of mercy, the prayer for the dead. If God was not full of mercy, mercy would have been in the world, not just in him. I who plucked flowers in the hills and looked down into all the valleys, I who brought corpses down from the hills, can tell you that the world is empty of mercy. I who must decipher riddles I don't want to decipher, I know that if not for the God full of mercy, there would be mercy in the world and not just in him. So Michal Springer teaches this because she feels two deep truths from this poem, and she wants her students to feel it too. Number one is it is okay to be angry. Amichai is angry at God. She was angry at God. It's okay to be angry at God. But two, it's what you do with that anger that's all important. And the energy of this poem is that you channel this anger into mercy. That is to say, that if God is full of compassion, so that there is no compassion in the world, if God is full of mercy, so that all the mercy's up there and no mercy is down here, it's on us to bring the mercy. It's on us to be the mercy. It's on us to convert our anger into mercy. Sarah Beth says to her, and how did that poem help you when your friend died and you didn't know what to do? And Michal Springer says, well, it's like this. I felt anger, and that poem challenged me to channel my anger, to make it a better world, to add mercy to the world. And I thought, how can I do this? And she realized that at the time she was at the seminary, there was no Jewish pastoral program. That is to say, rabbis and cantors at the seminary who wanted to get trained as a pastor to be with people in their most vulnerable hours had to get trained by Christian clergy in Christian programs. And that's true. That happened to me. My pastor was a Christian clergy. And she wondered, and that was fine, and that was lovely, and the Christian clergy had lovely moves. But why isn't there a Jewish pastoral program? And why can't we teach young rabbis and cantors Jewish texts on pastoral? So she created it and has been running it to this day. She felt bereft. She felt angry. She was challenged by Amichai's poem to channel it to a better world. And so she created the Jewish pastoral program. Now, at this point, Sarah Beth, who, if you listen to the 11 podcasts like we did, is usually very calm and collected, cool as the other side of a pillow, as the ESPN podcaster used to say. She's usually very cool. She breaks down. It's the only time in the podcast that the narrator, the host, breaks down. And she says, and you could just tell this is spontaneous. This is unscripted. The best stuff always happens unscripted, and this is unscripted. And Sarah Beth says to Michal Springer, I have a confession for you. I've been so angry at you for 10 years. You were my fiance's teacher in pastoral psychiatry. And when my fiance died, I don't even know why, but I got so angry at you. I studiously avoided you for 10 years. And not only did I studiously avoid you for 10 years, this is all on the podcast, I got meaning by studiously avoiding you. And only now that I hear you did I realize that the only person I hurt was myself. What you said about Amichai, what you said about moving from anger to mercy, I could have really used that 10 years ago. And I didn't. In other words, Sarah Beth lightning rodded Michal Springer. And the only person that hurt was Sarah Beth. But the story has a redemptive ending because 10 years later, she tells that story, and she tells it so that her listeners won't make the same mistake that she made. And that brings us to this moment. Lord, we are at a pivot point. We are at a pivot point. For the last 2 years, we had to move from pre-pandemic, from normal life, to the pandemic, where we've been for 2 years. Purim 2 marches ago. The world closed down. And we didn't agree, and that caused and resulted in all the kind of anger that has resulted in all the anger in the public square. And now we're in a pivot point where we're moving back from the pandemic to life after the pandemic, to living with, pick your noun, pick your formulation, but somehow going back to life. And that too is going to stir up all kinds of anger because we don't agree. We being human beings don't agree. So here is what Sarah Beth and Michal Springer say to us now. Let's resist the temptation to lightning rod other people with our anger, because when we do, we hurt the poor person who happens to be there at the wrong place at the wrong time, and we hurt ourselves. And instead, let's do what Yehuda Amichai invites us to do. Channel our anger into mercy. It's better for the world, and it is definitely better for us. Shabbat Shalom.